We're going to have a quick change of set at the moment and take away some of the chairs. And while we'll do that, I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts about the discussions we've had so far from my perspective. When I was in an earlier part of my career running the Lex column at the Financial Times, we used to try and always summarize whatever the topic of the day was in 3 bullet points or 3 paragraphs. And if I had to summarize what I've heard today, I'd put it down into 3 key points. Firstly, to cite General Tim Hawke, we've moved from a world where the US thought it made the waves to one where it has to surf the waves. And by that I mean the nature of power is shifting. No longer can we assume that big countries can crush small ones. It's really about speed and agility and flexibility. And we really are seeing the rise of asymmetric power. And we've been discussing how and why that matters. The second point that we just heard a lot from Major General Marlock is that the only way to cope with that world is to stress partnerships. Second bullet point, that partnerships are really emerging as crucial, not just across government, not just between countries and allies, but also between the public and private sector. And the question of how you do that is going to be one of the defining questions going forward, because I don't think that many people in the private sector who I speak to, be that investors or CEOs, have fully appreciated how that's changing. And the third point is that we are essentially, as Patel said, in a race against time. I think one of the most chilling comments of the day has been that what keeps her up at night is a question of whichever intelligence service works how to deploy AI, Gen AI, on its own data will end up winning. And who wins that race is not yet clear. So those are the points that I personally take away from the discussion today. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But what we're going to do now is have a change of gear and move from talking about the actual tangible realities of tech revolution, geopolitical conflict, and the military hardware and software to talking about some of the issues around information, and particularly around communication. It's a topic I love because I've been in the communication business as a journalist and columnist and editor for all my life. Before I did that, I was an anthropologist, and so I was also fascinated by cultural patterns of information. But the person you're going to hear from now who's going to talk about this is extremely well qualified to discuss it. It's Peter Singer, who is officially a strategist at New America, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and founder of Useful Fiction, a company specializing in strategic narrative. The description of him that I love, though, is that he's also officially a, quote, mad scientist for the US Army's Training and Doctrine Command. And he's written a number of books, both non-fiction books talking about the military, but also a number of non-fiction books, but also several novels talking about military and geopolitical themes as well, including one that some of you may have read, Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, and his latest is Burn-In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. So what Peter is going to do is to talk to us about what the military and security leaders are getting wrong about how they communicate their message to the wider public and the world. And then we'll have a quick fireside chat about some of the key questions that I've got. And also, if you have questions, do please send them over as well. Thank you. Peter, the stage is yours.
So thank you both for that very kind introduction, and also to the organizers. First, I want to thank them for the opportunity to come down to Nashville, escape DC. I got the requisite hot chicken last night, but also we've been able to have some really rich conversations about a variety of topics, as was referenced, that I've worked on in the past, whether it's new technologies, AI, rise of China, that it'd be fantastic to jump into with my .edu hat on, but what the organizers asked me to speak to is a problem that we all face, which is in the what next. And the way to think about this is that there is a double challenge that every organization faces, whether it is a military, government agency, a business, a university, including a university with a bold new initiative. And the double challenge is this. The first is understanding. You have to be able to identify and frame the new ideas, the new technologies, the new processes, the new opportunities, or what we've heard a lot about today, the new threats. But there's a second part, which is frankly something that we don't spend enough time thinking about, working on, training for, which is how do we communicate this new and therefore disruptive to our key target audiences. That is, how do we not just explain it, but how do we gain and retain the attention of those target audiences when so much else is competing for it in terms of both the media space, but also their mind space. That is, you're in competition with these ideas in terms of everything from what's out there in the media to what's on their mind to what's in their inbox. Now, most of us know what doesn't work, and yet what we keep using. It's the strategy paper that leaves us stupefied. It's the PowerPoint that leaves us mystified. And these are both real examples. And we also have something else that does work, which is what they asked me to speak to you today about, which is interesting because how do you wrestle with the new? A good approach is to use what is literally the oldest communication technology of all, which is story. Now, we've been at it in a project that we call Useful Fiction, and we've worked with organizations that range from Congress to Fortune 100 companies to the Marine Corps. And what we do is we blend together nonfiction research and analysis with the power of narrative. A different way of thinking about it is what we do is create smoothies. So at one end of the spectrum, you have science fiction. You've got techno thrillers, and I love them. But they're like milkshakes, right? They're designed for entertainment. Now, sometimes we'll say, yeah, but they've got good stuff in there, and they've influenced the world. Star Trek has created so many good things. But it's a lot like saying, there's strawberries in the strawberry milkshake. That's not why they were put in there, right? At the other end of the spectrum, we have the kale of the academic and policy world, right? It's the journal articles. It's the 100-page strategy report. What we're after is that thing in the middle. Let's start with those vegetables, those fruits, but bring in narrative and create something, as I'll get to later on, that's not only more likely to be consumed, but more likely to stick with you. And whatever, now I'm going to get back to being wonky. We're in an academic setting. And whatever form that narrative is in, and I think it's very important to foot stomp, when we say narrative, we don't always mean made up story. We don't always mean fiction. Narrative can be a true story. There was that time when I was in Nashville, ... But the point is, there are 6 key attributes for why using narrative, why using story is so important, so valuable. The first is the science from fields that range from, as you see here, international relations studies to cognitive science have repeatedly found that such synthetic experiences are a more effective means of conveying new and/or complex information. In fact, if they hook your brain up to a monitor and you read a journal article, you read Field Manual 3.0, one part of your brain will light up. If you read a story, 4 parts of your brain will light up. The reason why is it's basically evolution at work. As I referenced before, we've been using story to share new ideas, to share things that might be useful going back to when we were gathered in caves. By contrast, PowerPoint, as you can see there, was created in 1987. And yet, I'm going to do a quick question of the government and military folks in the room. How many of you have spent over 100 hours of your life using, training, getting good at PowerPoint? Interesting. Now, this idea of a new complex information, a project here that illustrates is something that was done by DSTL, which is the British government's version of doing some important defense research. They identified 8 key issues that are key to the future of Britain. A lot of the topics that we've talked about today, AI, robotics, quantum, et cetera. And their scientists and analysts spent 6 months. They created an incredible 138-page document on it. And you can guess, how that landed on their target audience of flag officers, defense ministers, and the like. And so what was done is let's take those 8 key topics and let's create a series of short stories that don't predict the future, but rather help you understand, help you visualize the key nonfiction points of it. They were, in fact, the theme cutting through all of them was grounding them in prominent moments from 20th century British history, but as if they were playing out in a world with these new technologies. So as an example, the one on the bottom right there was from the chapter on an issue that we've talked about a little bit, in fact, in the last session, which is how are changes in energy, new energy resources, rare earth, new energy networks from clean energy, what does that mean for the future of geopolitics? And the way that was in the original report, and the way it was shared in the narrative is through what you see there, which is an obituary for an imagined young officer who's just died in a motorcycle accident. It goes back to tell the story of their life on how they served in insurgencies in locations that had not been strategically significant, but because of a new energy find had become incredibly important. They then wrote a memoir about their life lessons. It's the story of Lawrence of Arabia, but as if taking place in the 2030s. Second value of narrative is it brings in emotion. And while we like to think that we are rational beings, again, studies of everything from decisions made in cabinet meetings on whether to go to war or not, to what kind of car to buy, are driven by emotion. It might be a positive emotion that you can be strategic. The one on the left there is a project that the Naval Expeditionary Combat Command did on visualizing its future in the Pacific as a way of seeing what success would look like. Or it could be a negative one. On the right, you see a project that we did that envisions an outcome in the Pacific that we never, ever want to see happen. And so you can say, I don't want that. What am I going to do to prevent it? What were some of the causes of it? Third value, change management. Now, in business, over 70% of organizational change efforts fail. I won't ask our friends from government and military what percent of government reform fail, but it's more than 70%. And when they look at the reasons behind those failures, it consistently comes back to narrative. And narrative in 3 different ways. The first is a failure to communicate the need for change. Second is a failure to communicate the vision for the future, the destination that we're headed towards. But the third is most often what happens is the leaders, the strategy team lays out a vision of change, everyone gets excited about it, and then after a couple of months, the frozen middle, the middle managers basically sink it in sort of playing out an insurgency. And the reason why is either they don't see themselves as characters in the story of change. What's in it for me? What's in it for people like me? Or worse, they see themselves as characters in the story of change, and they're the character of the victim. And so they'll just wait it out. And again, I'm sure that never happens in universities, never happens in business, never happens in militaries. So an example of how to potentially battle this was undertaken with General Brown. Back when he was head of the U.S. Air Force, he's now Chief of Staff of, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And basically, it transformed his strategic vision into what you see here, which is the what if, what would success look like? And the important date for our friends in the room here from the Air Force is it envisioned what it might look like in the year 2047, which is the 100-year birthday of the U.S. Air Force. And so it was a way of both communicating the strategy, what success would look like, but it also, going back to that idea of emotion, it created the sense of, hey, if we want our Air Force to look this way on its 100-year birthday, we kind of have to start acting right now. Another value proposition of narrative is studies from everything from Harvard Business Review to the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making have found is that it aids with innovation and forecasting. In fact, percentage-wise, it creates roughly a 30% more innovative outcome. There's a lot of different reasons behind this, but basically it comes down to how narratives help the mind envision new environments. The characters in them help the mind look at different perspectives. Plot lines, so to speak, help the mind envision possible actions, reactions, causes, and effects. One of the other things that I think very important, and goes back to the last couple panels, is that this is one of the areas where AI is not very good at it. It's not good at being creative, and the human mind is. So it's one of our competitive advantages for us to utilize. Example very relevant to this meeting is a project that was originally for Special Operations Command and then used in testimony to the House Armed Services Committee, which basically looked at the question of what would winning look like vis-a-vis China. Now, most of the discussion was about, how could we defeat China on the beaches of Taiwan? How we came at it instead is we said, what does victory look like? It looks like China deciding never to invade Taiwan. And that's deterrence, as you heard from some of the past questions. The important part from research, but also story, is that deterrence is not about your actions only. It's actually about the perceptions and decisions of your adversary. So the goal is a world, which we envisioned, where a PLA general looking back explains why they never ever decided to invade Taiwan and all the dastardly things that America and its allies did such that it was never the right time to invade China. Fifth is the ask. There is only one scarce resource: time. And so you have to figure out a way to pierce that. And whether it is again, a white paper or a proposal, you are making an ask of the reader's time and attention. Story, though, is a different kind of ask of their time and attention. In business terms, it has a lower barrier to entry. It's an easier way to reach people. Example here, on the left was an Australian government report, 21 pages, on the future of education reform related to national security. Pretty important topic. Team worked on it, very important, but didn't land with the targeted effect. And so working with them, we identified the 3 key themes in the report. It's 37 nonfiction nuggets, the vitamins in it that they wanted readers to know. And that report was transformed into what you see on the right, Eye for a Storm. Eye for a Storm is a story that follows a young officer on an exciting mission. It's an embassy evacuation in the wake of a tsunami. And then there's flashbacks to their time in college and the lessons that they learned in college and how they play out in that imagined future. You read it, you also get the 3 themes, you get the 37 nuggets. Why do I share that? One, if you can make the topic of education reform interesting, you can make any topic interesting. Second, the metrics. It was made into an Australian government document. It has so far had over 15,000 downloads. That's 2 orders of magnitude more than the original government document. It was also turned into an article for Task and Purpose, which is one of the more popular online military magazines for young members of the military and security community. But sometimes it's not about numbers. It's about the individual who. Among the readers of Eye for a Storm that we can confirm is the Chief of Defense of all of Australia and 7 US 4-star admirals and generals. Story reached them. The 6th and final value of story is connection and distribution. And it goes back to who we are as people. As humans, we connect over story. When we meet someone new, when we see an old friend or family member, we very quickly turn to stories of what we just did or what we just enjoyed. A movie that we saw, a TV that we saw, a book that we read that we enjoyed. It is very rare to find someone that said, I was on spring break and I read the best article in the Journal of Obscure No One Reads It Studies, and you would love it too. That's very rare, but we will do that about stories. We don't tell our partners this, but we actually can't help ourselves but to share bad stories. So, for example, I cannot stop myself from telling you how bad Rebel Moon is on Netflix. It is horrific. It is terrible. And then there's a bunch of you in the room who are going, no, it can't be that bad. I got to check it out. So that's the point of all of this. Rebel Moon's bad. Your one takeaway. I'll give you an example of this applied to some of the topics that we've been wrestling with today. Special Operations Command has been at the forefront of warfare and counterinsurgency and counterterrorism over the last generation. It's wrestling with what is its role in the topics that we've talked about of competition and conflict with China. And so its strategy was transformed into a series of narratives, as you see here, that envision what are the role that special operators might play in the topics that we've talked about today. It was originally designed for members of SOCOM to utilize instead of just their strategy paper, their partners in other parts of the military, Congress, et cetera. What's interesting, going back to this sort of viral effect, is we got this email from a professor at West Point, as you see there, the head of their Defense and Strategic Studies department, and no one ordered them. They're already using it in the West Point curricula, and as you can see, the students are liking it better than some of their other stuff. So it went viral on its own. Okay, last part of the conversation. How can we do this? Now, there's a couple ways when it comes to story. One, you can be a natural. You can be born a natural-born storyteller, a Mark Twain or whatnot. Or you have to learn it. It's the same thing when it comes to jokes. Some people are natural-born comedians. Some people have to learn the basics of it. I, for example, have seen Bill Gates effectively tell a joke, and he very clearly worked at it, but it worked. So what are these elements of a good story? And I'm going to foot stomp it again. When you're building a story, whether it's a true story, a fictionalized scenario, the next time you're writing an article, you're doing a brief, you're building a speech, what are the elements that you really have to have? What are the boxes that you have to check? First, you begin by asking yourself, who is my audience? What is my ask of them? But also, what can I do to show that I understand their world, their needs. What are the emotions that I want to trigger within them? If you can't answer that, you're not doing your job as a storyteller. Examples here that are comparable. On the left is a project for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It was the U.S. bipartisan, one of the last bipartisan commissions left, looked at U.S. cyber strategy. The executive summary of it was a narrative, but what was key is it not only shared the key points of it, but it was written specifically to go after their most important target audience. It's not the public, it's not the media, it's not even the senators and representatives. It's the congressional staffers, because they're the ones that actually write the legislation. So the narrative shared the key points, but went after them. A different one is on the right. It's from the Pentagon's AI office. They have a strategy, very important strategy. They don't have budget authority to make sure other people follow their strategy. So what you see here is the nightmare scenario for a program manager in the Pentagon. It's not, hey, if we don't get AI right, as we heard here, we could lose a war with China. The real nightmare scenario is Congress might do an investigation on your office. The boss might read that report over the weekend while they're having coffee, and they'll red highlighting and say, come in. And so what it is it's an imagined GAO report from the future, but the key points share the key points of the real world strategy. Next, every good story has a setting. It drops us into a place that is imagined because you're not there, but it has to feel real, recognizable, and importantly, your setting has to serve a purpose. Think of these 7 words. It was a dark and stormy night. It is a cliche of storytelling, right? But think how efficiently it was a dark and stormy night accomplishes a certain mission. We can all imagine it. It gives you a certain kind of feel. So, my recommendation is not to begin with it was a dark and stormy night, but rather, again, to think about the purpose that setting can be utilized. Here we see the work of one of the master strategic communicators out there right now. And you see how the setting of his communication does so much of the work, right? Third, do you have not just a character, but characters? And the characters that are needed for drama. Every story, whether it's the story of your life to what China is trying to accomplish, has heroes, victims, villains. Now, what's interesting is that often they're aligned. So if you think about your life history to China's Wolf Warrior messaging or messaging in the South China Sea, they're always both the hero and somehow the victim of the story, right? But think about your own life. You're almost always the hero and the victim. If you don't think character matters in story and policy, think for a minute how the story of Gaza and now U.S. policy has been transformed not by the raw numbers of thousands of civilian casualties, but crystallized in one voice, one character, Jose Andres of World Food Kitchen. Fourth and final, whether it's in character, whether it's in setting, tiny details do the work, and you have to be strategic about it. You cannot tell everything about the character, everything about the scene. And again, whether it's a true story or made-up story. So you have to be strategic with details. And the best illustration of this is John Wick and his dog. John Wick, over the course of his movies, has killed 439 people through everything from gunshots to books. Again, that is probably the one takeaway from this entire event that you will remember. But the point is, by all measures, John Wick is a mass murderer. And he kind of mumbles his way. Also, he doesn't really, say things that make you think much different. However, this one moment, John Wick likes his dog, but even more importantly, the dog likes John Wick, and it completely transforms the way we think about this mass murder. So we've talked about information environments. We've talked about China. Think about how we could focus on all the different elements of their policy. We could throw data points, et cetera, or we could find singular examples that crystallize the story of a nation violating international norms and bullying its neighbors. Which is more effective? Now, there's obviously much more to tell when it comes to crafting story, but there's one thing that every good story has, which is an ending, and ideally an ending that brings it all together. And the best, I think, at this was the old Twilight Zone TV series. And of all the episodes, there was one that really stands out. It was called All the Time in the World. And if you'll permit me, I'll tell the story of All the Time in the World. So in it, there is this guy. He's this nerdy guy who works in a bank. He's loves books, and he just can't help himself. He's always sneaking away to read books. He's not very interactive with his colleagues. Basically, he should have been an academic. But the point is that he does it again. Can't help himself. He sneaks down into the bank vault, and he's reading, but while he's in there, suddenly it all shakes, and dust comes from the ceiling. And he goes upstairs, and nuclear Armageddon has happened. Everything's destroyed. His city is in ruins, and he's walking through the rubble of it, and he's, this academic, this nerdy guy is now literally the last man standing. He's alone. And then he passes a library. And there's pile upon pile of books there. And he gets a smile on his face because it may be dystopia, but he has found his utopia. He has all the time in the world to do what he wants to do, which is just to be alone and read. And so he reaches down to pick up a book, and his glasses slide off, and he frantically searches for them. And then, crunch, he stepped on his glasses. So now he has all the time in the world to read, but he can't. I don't have all the time in the world to keep talking to you, so I will leave you with this. Story is not a replacement for data, for research, for white papers. But it can be a powerful tool to enhance white papers, data, research, if we're just willing to deploy this technology that resides in all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. I found that absolutely fascinating. I am admittedly quite biased because I've been a journalist for the last 30 years, apart from being a cultural anthropologist. And so I've been trained to tell stories in all kinds of forms, and I've written various books myself. But I must say, I absolutely relish and welcome the comments you make, because since I've been on the receiving end of all manner of ghastly press releases from government bodies, if they could only become slightly less ghastly, I would be absolutely delighted. So we will have a chance for any of you to ask questions who'd like to. Do please email them into that email address at the bottom up there. But before we do get any questions, I've got a couple of questions myself. The first is, what grade would you give most of the national security institutions and military institutions that we see in Washington that have been represented on the stage today in terms of their ability to do storytelling? I mean, are they getting an A, B, C? And which direction are they going in at the moment?
Well, you're putting your journalist hat on there.
You can think of me as a college head if you want, instead, giving students grades.
The key is that we can parse out. You said the organizations, not the individuals. So we're clarifying this is not about any of the individuals that stepped onto this stage, but rather the national security community.
Or to put it another way, who's doing it well? Who would you give a better than average grade to, and who's doing it really badly?
So, I'm a professor as well, but I do not believe in the grade inflation issues. And so, for the most part, I think we are in the C's and D's range in effectively telling the story of whether it is new challenges, whether it is new technologies, whether it is new threats, whether it is new opportunities. And it's quite easy to identify a topic. It's quite easy on any topic to look at it and say, you know what, how could we better tell that story? And I don't think I'm saying anything novel. If you go to almost any organization and say, are there parts of your story that you don't think you're telling effectively? Are there groups that you're not reaching, or groups that you're reaching but they're not acting in the way that you hope to achieve? Did you spend a lot of time on a report and it didn't resonate to reflect the amount of time that you did? I think that's, almost every organization would probably say, yeah, that's us. I think in particular, as as we've heard on stage, we see this in, very clear and obvious areas of narrative, information operations, but I think it also, again, applies to broader topics. If you want to drill down on one.
Absolutely, I'd love to. Do you want to name any names of organizations that are getting a C or a D or a B?
Again, I gave almost all of them a C or D, so I'll play it safe and leave it at that.
Right. Well,
I'll put it this way: any organization that thinks it's doing in the U.S. government that thinks it's doing a really good job at telling its story is probably telling a story to itself, which is a lie.
Right. Well, that's very tactful, or not. But because I've had a lot of conversations over the years with central bank governors and financial officials around this, because in many ways they face the same problem as military and security leaders, in that they are in charge of a public good and platform which matters enormously to the population, which no one understands, and where most of the people who rise to the top of them are dreadful at communication and storytelling. Do you think that there are lessons that the military and security world can learn from other areas of government or business about how to tell stories better or how to get better at it? Or any lessons that Americans can learn from other parts of the world?
So I think there's a couple of things there. One, often what we're talking about here is sort of the strategic communications element of it is within government, too often either an afterthought after the policy is developed, after the paper, we've spent 6 months creating the doctrine, the paper, and then it's, well, how do we communicate it? Rather than, most businesses would be they would have simultaneous product development research, but they'd also be, trying to understand the target audiences, the customer base, trying to understand the influencers, trying to build the plan around the rollout of it. Related, most political campaigns would not treat it as a one-off, but as a campaign. There's sort of an irony that very few organizations on the government side think about having a campaign plan related to their important documents. So they'll, spend huge amounts of times creating a strategy, a doctrine, a posture review, insert name here, and they'll have the rollout of it, and it'll be like, you spent 9 months on that product, and you're going to spend like 3 days on it communicating it, rather than thinking about it as this extended campaign that I want to have actions and effects over not just days, but weeks, but years. I'll leave it at that.
Right. I'm curious because...
Can I add one more thing in? And it's something that is a challenge that you probably experience related to the financial world. It's something we definitely see in scientists, analytic reports, including from the agencies here. There is this, and frankly also students, it's the flaw as a reporter of, the phrase, emptying your notebook. I gathered all the data. I spent time gathering the data. Therefore, I have to share it with you, both because I spent time doing it, I interviewed that person, I did that study, and/or I need to show I'm really, really smart. And we often overwhelm people with the data, with the details, through that, rather than trying to find the story in it. Sometimes I use the phrase, so very apt to being in Nashville, think of it like salt in cooking. You need a little, if you don't have it in there, the meal will fail, but if you add too much, you can also ruin the meal, you can ruin the report, you can ruin the article. And again, whether it's a newspaper article or a journal article.
Absolutely. I used to say when I was running the financial section for the FT, I used to tell the reporters who were dealing with really complex, geeky financial data, which was so abstract and disembodied, it was very hard to communicate. Just try and tell me what you imagine as being the illustration for this story, the one visual image that captures it, and that forces people to boil down what they're trying to say amid the complexity into one key thought and message. Because the reality is when people put down newspaper articles, they only ever remember one or two things, and you have to try and make sure they remember the right things.
There's another, that's a great technique. There's another one that can be, imagine what is going to be the title of that article, or even better, what is going to be the title of the article written about your report, your program of change, and then work backwards from it. It's called Imagine Future Perfect History. Another one for both business and government reform, but again also academic reforms is, as an example, imagine the retirement speech that you would give. And then, okay, what do I need to do?
Or imagine what's going to be in your tombstone in the future.
Yes. But that's a little more dismal than but the very last day of work. What is it that you're going to look back and thank people and tell people that you are most proud of accomplishing, and then go hold it at my own pace to achieve that.
Yeah. One other thing I'll add into that is that I also used to teach reporters a lot about what I call the domino theory of communication, which doesn't mean dominoes toppling over in a line. It means that you have to imagine you've got two dominoes, plastic pieces with two numbers on. And the game is to try and match one half of your domino with someone else's number. So you have to give them something that hooks into what they already know and resonate with. But then the other half of the domino can take them somewhere completely different. But if you give them a number that doesn't match at all and doesn't in any way hook in with your audience, it's hopeless. Mm-hmm. But we've got a lot of great questions here actually coming in. One question I love, I'm very biased on this, is we've heard today about the key need to attract the best and right talent to the mission. We hear a lot about critical thinking, communication, and writing skills. Taking a page from your own strategies, let's have you imagine what national security efforts would look like in 2047 if we were successful in recruiting aggressively from the humanities in addition to STEM and CS. What would happen if you had a whole bunch of English majors and, dare I say it, anthropology majors running around with computer scientists?
So
you might get some culture clash.
Yeah, well, but actually culture clash can be a really good thing. So I think what you would again, we'd work backwards. We just had a panel on cyber. So you and I are going to do a story creation right here up on stage. So we just had a panel on cyber. So what we would want to do is imagine a highly effective team in facing some kind of emergent cyber threat. So we would not have the threat be something of today because that's easy, we'd solve it. But what's a realistic trend line of something we might face in the future, AI-enabled misinformation attack, whatever. But then we would say, okay, what would the team look like solving this problem? They would have a diverse set of skills, not just because we want a diverse cast of characters, but we know that research, both within the military, but also in studies of corporations, find that diverse teams lead to more effective outcomes. So, and diverse defined as people who think differently, have different experiences, have different education. So, if I'm trying to defend against a cyber threat, it'd be awesome to have computer scientists, but also, if it's a financial network thing, I need someone who understands financial networks. Or if there's a misdisinformation element to it, to your humanities issues, that's about narratives. What narratives are taking off? What narratives are not taking off? Okay, we've got this team. How did they join? Well, as you've heard from, for example, the general, there was pathways that allowed them to join rapidly. That's fiction right now for much of government. We might want pathways that allow people to move inside and outside of government, so I could gain experience in government, join private sector, but return without having to start all over again. It might go earlier. The motivation. Why did these great people want to join that team? Well, we had narratives of what it meant to be a cyber warrior, what it meant to serve, that they were exposed to at some point earlier in their life. And so again, you can kind of, back to your dominoes, you'd work backwards from that vision. And then we go, okay, what are the mechanisms that we have today to achieve this? What are the mechanisms that we don't, but we could put in place? And what I just laid out is an example of real-world programs on, for example, creating a cyber auxiliary, which is a pathway for allowing people, private sector academia, to help government, but not have to join the National Guard.
Right. Right. Well, some of this is already happening in the private sector. Something that most people don't know is that the second biggest employer of cultural anthropologists in the world is Microsoft, because they recognize that computer science needs social science or human science to actually be effective. And there's a whole world of emerging, what I call digital anthropology, looking at the communications issue. Which leads me to another question, which is, how do you counter an adversary who weaves a compelling narrative?
So there's a couple of things, and this relates to information warfare threats, whether we're going back and looking at what played out in 2016 against the U.S. election, but also similar kinds of targeting of fellow democracies. Studies found over 36 other partner democracies have been targeted in the same way, if we're looking at Chinese attempts to reach into the politics of partners like a Philippines or a Taiwan, a Japan. So a couple of things. One is you want to be able to identify the efforts to plant these narratives and the networks that they're utilizing. Some of this may involve covert means that we can't talk about on stage. But the great thing about foreign adversary or disinformation campaigns is to be successful, they have to go public. They have to, in a sense, expose themselves. Okay, you want to understand which narratives are being planted, which narratives are starting to take off. Russia in particular has the spaghetti against the wall strategy. They throw a lot of crap against the wall. Most of it doesn't take off. You don't need to counter it all. In fact, if you try and respond to it all, you're giving attention to it. You want to understand the networks that they're utilizing, some of the networks and nodes, some of which they own and operate and control themselves. The false front media outlets, false front sock puppet accounts. Bluntly, you also want to understand the network that they rely on of what the Soviets used to call useful idiots, was their translation. It's people in our own culture and politics who elevate foreign disinformation because they see it as good for their own political prospects.
Well, I think we've seen some of that recently in Washington in Congress.
That would never, ever happen, except for the fact that we've had multiple members of Congress openly voice Russian propaganda. Okay? Next, I could go. I so much want to go on that, but I'm going to. Okay, so you want to understand the nodes. Lesson from Ukraine: you do not wait to debunk. You pre-bunk, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics. After the fact responses do not work. You want to establish your own narratives, your counter narratives, your own facts beforehand. So, for example, the Ukrainians were the Russian stratagem before the invasion of Ukraine was to lay the groundwork for a narrative which was there is an emergency going on inside Ukraine, there's atrocities and violations, and we are responding, we are rescuing, and instead, the Ukrainians and the larger, the US, the UK, basically didn't wait for that to happen. They pushed out, everything from large scale, you might remember, satellite photos of military buildup, to micro narratives such as here's an image, here's someone on a highway, and notice the train going by that's loaded with Russian tanks. So they're gearing up for something. They're not responding to it. In your responses, you do not have a singular narrative. You do not have one response. This is a major flaw of government and a lot of failed political campaigns, is to assume that you have the single story, and despite the fact that you have multiple different target audiences out there. So you want to flood the zone with your counter narratives that might be large scale, might be small scale. So going back to that example of Ukraine, remember they were countering Russian narrative with everything from the tale of the ghost of Kiev, the supposed fighter Ace, to the
Snake Island, yeah.
Snake Island, to the old woman who goes up to the Russian soldiers and says, "Here's some sunflower seeds. Plant them, for when you die."
Yeah.
Next issue, I'll end on with this, is you need to have a network that elevates your narratives. So that old woman. It's interesting that she just happened to be videoed, gets popped up on YouTube, and within a matter of hours, it's being elevated by everything from official government accounts to individual leader accounts to influencer accounts. That's how you go viral. You have a network working for you. The last thing it'll end on, since this will be the second reference appropriately made to her here, is when in doubt, when it comes to information operations, ask yourself what the Marie von Clausewitz of information warfare, Taylor Swift, would do.
That's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Because that leads to the other question I was going to ask. I'm really conscious that we are what stands between the audience and drinks right now. So the other question I wanted to ask was really on this Taylor Swift point. Having tracked the Ukrainian situation very closely, I did my PhD in the Soviet Union, in fact, and I've been tracking closely what the Ukrainian government's been doing on the information side. How has social media changed this game? Because at the end of the day, what really pre-bunked things from Ukraine, what changed the narrative in Ukraine, above all else, was, dare I say it, TikTok imagery, it was social media imagery, it was visual imagery. It wasn't the kind of text-based storytelling that most of us have grown up assuming was dominant. So are we living in a world where basically if you want to pre-bunk or get your message out, you have to think visual first?
I don't think you have to think visual first, but you do have to recognize the different communication channels that people are using first, and so what works or what doesn't work on those communication channels. Secondly, the old adage that, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Broader answer to your question, 2 points to end on. Anyone who doubts the power of story, the power of the weaponization of social media, do the counterfactual of Ukraine. Imagine a world where a Zelensky had not been able to go viral. Well, we can run some of the numbers of it. Within Ukraine, before the conflict, he was at 23% levels of popularity. He was basically the most popular of a deeply unpopular set of political figures. After about 10 days of his incredibly effective strategic communications, he was at 90% levels of popularity. But it was not just merely helping to unify a fractured public. Do the counterfactuals of how he becomes a global icon, and in turn, how his larger efforts help change the politics of what was viewed as even not just possible, but what we ought to do to support Ukraine. Not just the U.S., but allies as far away as Japan, Australia are providing military aid, economic sanctions, et cetera, just well past what anyone had anticipated. But I'll end on this. My concern for Ukrainian information operations, but how we have to think about vis-a-vis China, is your goal is not just merely to win the opening battle, the opening conversation. You have to think of it as an extended competition, an extended campaign, and that's the concern that I have if we're looking at Ukraine right now is we have lost the story, so to speak, when it comes to the value and importance of supporting them, not just as it relates to Ukraine and Russia, but as it relates to the larger topic of this conference, which is the lessons that other adversaries and allies in the Pacific would take from failure in Ukraine.
Right. Well, I'll simply add one tiny anecdote to that, which is that I've been back and forth to Kiev myself quite a few times recently and spent time with Zelensky and most importantly, his advisor, Andrei Yermak, in Kiev. And everyone knows that Zelensky was basically this television comedy star. What people generally don't realize is that Yermak, who's driving the show, was previously his producer and essentially running a production company. And they told me early in the war that basically they were treating the whole thing as being a bit like a production. And that staging of that video, that selfie in the courtyard on the first night where they all stood there and said, toot, 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 we're all here, 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 was very much the brainchild of the production company around Zelensky. He brought the entire TV crew into government. As you say, the danger of that is that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and they're in a long-running series, and they have to refresh the product right now, to be cynical and put it in sort of television terms. But the extraordinary message for anyone involved in security or geopolitical affairs right now is, as you say, communication in an effective 21st century way really can change the state of warfare, the state of the world, and the state of how people perceive things going forward. So thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful way to end the first day. Thank you to everyone who's been on stage for such an incredibly interesting, both inspiring and sobering set of conversations. Thank you to Vanderbilt for staging all this and for teaching us all so much. And right now, I think we all deserve a drink. Thank you.